trials in MDS are carried out quite similar to clinical trials in many other diseases. There are some specific nuances for clinical trials for patients suffering with myelodysplastic syndrome. I'll make many general comments at the beginning. There's actually different flavors of trials. Today, I will focus predominantly on interventional trials, but I'll also mention that there are observational trials where nothing is perhaps given or done to a patient, but they are observed over the course of their disease. And there also can be trials where blood samples or bone marrow samples are the primary goal of being on the trial. But let's spend the majority of our time on interventional clinical trials. Some specific generalities are that clinical trials are offered at the center where they're open. And what I mean by this is a patient does need to be treated on the clinical trial most of the time at the center that's conducting the trial. Many trials can be single center, but many can also be multi-center. So it doesn't mean it's only available at one place, but it is specific to how the care is provided. In terms of the types of clinical trials, we have phase 1 trials, which focus on safety. And on average, these have somewhere between 20 and 50 patients, occasionally a bit more, but in the MDS space, these are small trials. And usually this is the first time a drug is approved for testing in human beings with MDS. It might have been studied in other diseases, but that's less likely. These are often also called early phase or first in human trials. Now, phase 2 trials, which I think are a bit more common for what some people listening to this are looking for, are safety and dosing. And again, MDS trials tend to have fewer participants than perhaps a different solid tumor disease, but these can be somewhere between 50 and 100 patients, or maybe a little larger. A phase 3 clinical trial is both for safety, as always, that's the forefront of our minds for our patients, but also for efficacy, or really how can this work for an individual with MDS to improve their disease course. And phase 3 clinical trials are much larger. Some people call them registration trials. They're certainly multi-center and often multinational. Even international studies offered at a whole lot of sites, sometimes 30 or 40, whereas the earlier phases 1 and 2 that I mentioned are often only offered at a few sites. In terms of a phase 3, sometimes we see 200 patients, 400, sometimes over 500. So they're just much larger with the goal of compiling the data specific to the United States to present to the FDA or the Federal Drug Administration trying to get approval for these medicines. They're not always positive trials, and so that doesn't guarantee that a drug that's in a phase 3 study ultimately comes to approval for treatment standardly to patients with MDS, but that is the goal. We talk less about phase 4 trials, but that would be after a drug has been approved by whatever regulatory authority, and then it's considered surveillance for understanding longer term outcomes in patients getting a drug that's still relatively new.